Hello, Sergey.
Hello.
Good to see you again. We are on March 17th, which is St. Patrick's Day.
Yes,
So we're
it is also
talking,
my pleasure to be here again.
well, thank you. We're talking about Ukraine, and we're talking about a conflict or a dispute that's arisen regarding one of the most sacred places in Ukraine, the Lavra in Kiev, which is now, I wanted to look at these pictures of maps to allow people to get a sense of where we are. And we're going to discuss this conflict over this monastery, this Lavra, this holy place. It's kind of a shame that there should be a dispute over a holy place of prayer. Is this, let's begin by asking you, um, is this a matter that's, we'll talk about these maps and then introduce the situation, but is it a matter to you of deep interest and concern?
Yes, it is. I am professor of the Theological Academy, and its place is in Lavra. And I also member of the Department for External Church Relations of our church. Its place also in Lavra. That's why I have two institutions that I am connected to, and both of them can have no place in 2 weeks. So maybe in 2 weeks I have only home office and nothing more.
Okay, you're saying that for years you've been working in this Lavra, which is in Kiev, on the banks of the river, and it's been there for 1,000 years. You've had offices as a theologian, as a professor, and also as an official of your church, which is one of the two major Orthodox churches in Ukraine. Yours is the Ukrainian Orthodox Church, and the other is the Orthodox Church of Ukraine. And in 2 weeks, on March, or less than 2 weeks, March 29th, as I understand it, you and all members of the Orthodox Church, the Ukrainian Orthodox Church, are going to have to leave the Lavra. This is the essence of the dispute. You've lost, in a sense, your right to be in a place where you have been for many years, decades, and centuries. Is that correct?
Yes, it is possible. So, since approximately a week, there was a decision that our institutions of our church cannot be anymore in Lavra, and it is not clear what can be later. So, for example, some people, some representatives of our church are ready to leave this place. Some of them are not ready to leave, and they want to uh, to have a kind of battle, maybe in the course, maybe in some other possibilities. So different people, different opinions. That's why it is not clear now what will be in 2 weeks for the whole complex of Lavra.
All right. Now, as we look at this map, just to orient ourselves, once again, the regional areas of religion in Ukraine, the distribution of Christian churches in Ukraine, all of us are Christians together, but institutionally there have come to be divisions. There are, of course, some non Christians and uh, groups of Muslims and of Jews also living in Ukraine, but the majority are Christian, and yet they are very divided. And as we look at this map, on the black area on the right side, we see the two areas where most of the fighting has occurred in this war, Luhansk and Donetsk. And more or less in the middle of Donetsk, more or less where the D in Donetsk is Bakhmut, where there's this tremendous battle that's been going on for 2 months, and it's a terrible and bloody battle. And our ultimate interest, of course, is some type of reason and understanding and peace. But in the midst of this tremendous conflict, there is another battle emerging in the center there in Kiev, where you are this evening, and that is over this Lavra, which is sort of the symbolic center of the Orthodox faith in Ukraine. And there's a picture of this Lavra. Can you say anything? Can you describe what we see here in this picture?
Yes, it is the site of Lavra from the upper part of this complex to the lower part. And these are the buildings. So a little bit on the right from the center of the photo, there is an academic church. So the church of the Theological Academy, and our students pray every morning and every evening in this church.
Yes.
So, after that, we can see the bell tower. So these are, and some buildings before. These are, I suppose, the buildings of the seminary and academy, and also of the monastery. Which is important for us. It is a large territory, and in fact, there are three institutions. All of them belong to our church, but nevertheless, it is necessary to make difference. So it is monastery, first of all, so monks and people that are in the monastery, but also it is theological academy and seminary, educational center of our church, and also administrative center, Kiev Metropolitan Office. So these are three institutions, and these problems with the state and with this reserve officially that belongs this complex to is the problem for all of them. And I have already mentioned in two images of this, in two aspects, it belongs also, it is concerns also me personally.
Okay. Now the river there is
Dnipro or Dnieper. Dnipro.
and so
In Ukraine.
those two words are Ukrainian and Russian?
Yes. So it is near, it is Dnipro in Ukrainian, Dnieper in Russian,
Okay.
and it is not a large difference, but nevertheless, it is not the same. So
All right.
you can say about the city, Kiev in Ukrainian, Kiev in Russian. So similar words, but not the same.
All right.
ones.
And somewhere in that river, there was an event that was culturally and religiously significant in the history of the Slavic peoples, both Russian, Ukrainian, Belarusian. And what was that event?
So there are several different opinions, and one of them is that it was in the part of Kiev, Podil. It is lower part of the city. It is maybe 3-4 kilometers from Lavra. Not far, not really far.
So looking into the distance.
No.
No, looking behind where the photo is taken from.
Yes.
So the river is traveling from northern Ukraine all the way down to the Black Sea.
Yes,
And-
it is.
And which way is the river flowing? Right in from this
Well,
picture.
we are Lavra is on the right bank. It means that the flower is from us to the end of this photo.
Okay, so in a sense, as it flows in the direction we're looking at, it goes down through all the center of Ukraine and finally reaches the Black Sea. And then behind us, to a certain extent, is up the northern border, which would be where Chernobyl is.
Yes, it is.
Did I mispronounce it? How do you pronounce?
In Ukrainian, Chernobyl. In Russian, Chernobyl. Almost the same.
So, in the year 988, so 1,000 and almost 30 years ago, and almost 1,000 years after the time of Jesus Christ, there was an event in this river. And you think it might be 3 or 4 kilometers away from this photo, but others think maybe it was right near where this photo was taken.
Yes. So it was the baptism of people of Kiev Rus. So the state of that time was Kiev Rus. So this from that word comes Russia or Russland in German. So Rus is the title officially, and Kiev Rus. So we can see in the history different periods of this Rus, and Kiev Rus is the country with the center, with the capital in Kiev. And in that time, the most part of the population belonged to the pagans, and according to the state authorities of the time of Prince Volodymyr, it was decided that all people should be baptized in the faith of this Prince Volodymyr, so in Christianity and especially of the Byzantine Rite. So it was an important connection to Constantinople, and also, for example, to Bulgaria, and the liturgical books that were used after that in our country were of the Bulgarian origin. So this Church Slavonic language that we use now in a modern way, but once it was an old Bulgarian language. So it is an important connection to Byzantine through Bulgaria.
Well, one important point I would think is that 988, when this Prince Volodymyr, or we would call him Vladimir, correct?
In Russian.
Okay. This was still before the year 1054. It was 66 years before 1054, and 1054 was the schism, the break between Rome and Constantinople, between Catholicism and Orthodoxy. Up until then, and at this time, they were united. It was one church. And yeah, correct?
Yes, the church was united officially. So it is an issue of discussion. So this was a large schism in a year 1054. But there were smaller schisms. For example, the schism of 40, the Patriarch of Constantinople,
Yes.
at the end of the 9th century. So
Yes.
there was a period of different problems between the western part and the eastern part of the churches. But it is known that in our place, in Kiev Rus, this schism is known only since the 13th century. So you can say that till 200 years, these problems in the east, in the west from our country, were not really known for our people that lived here. So it was only a retrospective vision that this was so important for our history. So in that time, it was not so obvious for many people.
All right. And the reason I bring this point up about 988 and 1054 is my interest is to find common ground, and it really is a cultural distinction between Greece and Rome, or between Constantinople, Byzantium, and Rome. Constantinople speaking Greek and Rome speaking Latin, and they were nevertheless sharing the same scriptures, the same sacraments, and a very similar liturgy. And the Byzantine liturgy was what you emphasized. This was the liturgy that they celebrated when they became Christians. And that's what's continued today. For 1,000 years, the Byzantine liturgy has been the liturgy of the Slavic peoples. But over time, there's been a number of attempts to reestablish relations with Rome and to overcome that division between the Greek East and the Latin West. And one of the places that's most critical for this is Kiev and also Russia, because more than half of all the Orthodox in the world live in these regions. So if people are interested in gathering together all the Christians together as one Christian community, it's important to be aware of this history and to be in dialogue with these peoples. Is that correct, do you think?
Yes, it is. So, if you speak about this division in two parts, Western Latin part and Eastern uh, Greek part, I would say the language was mostly important. So, this division, if you know only one language, and it was usually in the Middle Ages,
Yes.
you couldn't really not belong culturally to another part,
Hmm.
and it was more important that than these dogmatic differences, I suppose.
Well, that's the issue. The faith is expressed in different languages and even in different rituals and gestures, but the essential points of the faith, the doctrines of the faith expressed in the creeds of the church, are the same.
Yes,
And
it is.
so, what we are talking about is a cultural division, not a religious division.
Yes, I can say even more. For example, in the 19th century, uh, in this place there was the Russian Empire, and the current Ukraine was an important part of this Russian Empire. And in Kiev Theological Academy, there were translations of the Holy Fathers from Latin. So we had three theological academies in that time. In Moscow and in Petersburg, they have translated from Greek, and in Kiev, the teachers and the students have translated Holy Fathers from Latin. So it is a good example of this influence from the West in the current Ukraine. And one another example is Peter Mohila.
Yes,
He was Metropolitan of Kiev in the 17th century, and it is also an important example of this influence of the Western spirituality on, on religiosity in our country. So sometimes we can see that relationships between Rome and Greece were worse than a relationship between Rome and Kiev.
yes.
Uh,
Interesting.
so Kiev and also Moscow. And also in the 20th century, we know examples of very good relationships between the Russian Orthodox Church and Vatican. And I suppose sometimes it was also better than between Vatican and Greek churches. So it is culturally to see, but also it is important to have maybe political or geopolitical understanding of the situation in different contexts.
Yeah, I mean, the reason I keep coming back to this point of what unites and what divides both the peoples in that region, but also that region from Rome and from the Catholic Church and the Christians of the East from the Christians of the West, is that it seems that to me that there could be a useful role in all of the current conflict, which is so terrible and bloody, of the religious people. There could be a kind of a religious off ramp, as opposed to talking about who's got missiles and who's got territory. We could return to the concept of who has faith and how can we realize that some things we do share. Of course, so much blood has now been shed that this sounds almost foolish and impossible, but I still regard it as a possible way forward.
Yes, you are right. We can say about, for example, about the document of the Russian Orthodox Church of the year 2000. There was a document about the attitude to other Christian denominations, and it is clear that this official attitude to the Catholic Church is much better than to other Protestant churches, for example.
Right.
So there are different levels of cooperation, different levels of communion between the Catholic Church and Russian Orthodox Church, and in this sense, with Ukrainian Orthodox Church as a part of this Russian Church, as it was till the war, till the beginning of the war.
Okay, now we are precisely at the point. The Russian Orthodox Church was, in a sense, not even so much Russian, it was Slavic in a sense. It was not oriented just towards the Russian people and government, but also peoples outside of Russia. Am I correct?
Yes, it is. So, if we speak about the Orthodox world as a whole, we can see the picture of the 19th century. There were two empires, the Russian Empire with the Orthodox rulers, and the Ottoman Empire with the Muslim rulers.
Yeah.
So this is the main distinction. So now in the modern world we have uh, 15 local churches. Officially, it was not the case in that time. So it is traditionally to think about two main directions in in the Orthodox Church as a whole: the Greek direction and the Slavic direction.
Hmm.
For example, Poland or Czech Republic or some other places were controlled by the Russian Empire, and that's why there was political influence, cultural influence on these parts of the territory. And Ukraine was a part of this Russian Empire. That's why it is usual for us for centuries to be connected to this um, Russian-centered influence, maybe we can say in this way. And
Yeah.
we can speak also about Ukrainian influences on Russia. For example, there is a joke about about the rulers of the Soviet Union. Four of them were of Ukrainian ethnic origin. So
Yeah.
it is false to say about this influence from one side on another side. It was in both directions, but in any way, I suppose it is correctly to say for centuries there was a Russian Empire uh, or a union between the current Ukraine and Russia since the middle of the 17th century. And it was also the case in the Soviet time, in the 20th century. So for several centuries, Ukraine, the most part of Ukraine, especially Kiev region, was a part of this Russian state, and that's why there are different kinds of cooperation contexts between Russia and Ukraine. And it was also a hope of Vladimir Putin, I suppose, that these connections are so deep that that our people, our population is much more connected to each other and is ready to exist in one state than it was in fact. So Ukraine exists since 30 years independently, and now we see um, Ukrainian people ethnically, or the the people that live here, uh, uh, not really like anymore this idea of the former Soviet Union of being together, of fighting against the West and so on, that we can see and hear now from the Russian propaganda.
Well, I don't really want to go into that too much, but it's so divisive and so easily emotional because so much pain has been caused. So I'm going to leave it for a moment. Yeah, eventually, my hope would be that religious discussion could help to lead to a solution and a kind of mutual commitment to live together in peace. But let's go back. Can our producers put the Lavra picture back on the screen? All right, thank you. We are looking at the Lavra, the most holy shrine, I would say, if I'm not incorrect, in all of Ukraine. And the government in January said that the people who had been in there, which included you, Sergei, have to leave by March 29th. And the Patriarch of the Russian Orthodox, the much uh, disputed Patriarch Kirill, issued a statement a few days ago saying that this is a religious matter and that the state of Ukraine is entering into a type of religious persecution here. And what are the threads and issues related to this building? First of all, we see the name of it is the Monastery of the Caves. Where are the caves? And how old is this building? And how important is this to Ukrainian spirit and national identity?
So it is difficult to speak about this deep connection. I would say in Ukraine there are officially a lot of Christians and especially a lot of Orthodox Christians, but I'm not sure that there are so many people that are deeply religious people. If we compare Ukraine to other countries, especially to Russia, yes, there are some surveys that our religiosity is deeper. So, for example, people visit worships more often. But I would say, nevertheless, that for a majority of people, the faith is not on the first place of their lives. This is the conflict. This is the problem now in Ukraine. I would say there is maybe 10% of population in Ukraine that are really concentrated on their faith, that their faith is important in their lives. And I suppose that many of them, majority of them, are belonging to our church, Ukrainian Orthodox Church. And less of these religious people belong to this other church, Orthodox Church of Ukraine. But the problem is there are maybe several percent of Catholics and Protestants, but many people were baptized as Orthodox Christians, but they don't really have the faith as an integral part of their lives. That's why they can be politically motivated. And now, in the situation of the war, very often they are against Russia, against the so-called Russian church in Ukraine, and so on. And that's why I would say these people can be manipulated because of this connection of our church to the Moscow Patriarchate.
All right.
So it is important in the Ukrainian context.
Well, you've said some very important things, and we should be very careful to go back through what you said. You said the so-called relationship of your church, or your so-called connection of your church with the Moscow church. You also started by saying the secularizing process, which we know very well in Western Europe, and we know it in Canada, the United States. Christians can hardly say that they themselves put religion always first in their lives because we're all concerned about our jobs and our monetary situation and political issues that aren't necessarily religious but sort of cultural. In other words, religion in the West is also under the impact of secularism, secular humanism, we might call it. And in your situation, both in Ukraine and in Russia, you went through 70 years of the Soviet Union. And that was a very specific regime that specifically forbid religious belief. It was state atheism. It said that religious belief was so foolish, so silly, so demented, that it was almost a medical matter. It was a matter of a mental deficiency or almost a medical psychological problem. People clutching at the idea of a God or a heaven when very pragmatic Marxist, Leninist socialism was focused on building up this world into a society that would be the workers' paradise, and religion was somehow a great opponent of this process And so many, many thousands of Christian, Orthodox, and also Catholic priests were arrested and were put in gulags and died there. And then the last 30 years, we all thought with the passing of the Soviet Union that we might be in a period of a flowering of religious faith and belief. But what has now occurred is a further division, the renewed influence of secular thought, humanistic thought. And so religion didn't recover after the end of the period of the Soviet Union, but is drifting. And now, in the context of this war, there's even more division, hatred, and the idea of Christians reunifying seems impossible. Am I correct?
So there are different opinions on this matter. Officially, the state wants to establish a united Orthodox Church in Ukraine. And from the first side, it is positive. So we have one Ukrainian state. In this one state should be one Orthodox Church. But the problem is that we have this division between two main Orthodox churches since 30 years.
Okay, perhaps we could show a couple of slides here, and you could comment on first. The two main churches are one that is autocephalous, that is broken away from Moscow, and the other which has still some connection, but is also broken away from Moscow, but retains a connection, and that is the Ukrainian Orthodox Church, and that's the church that you're part of. But could we ask the producers to show a couple of, yeah, let's look at, all right, Metropolitan Epiphany or Epiphanius. This is the other church that is the Ukrainian National Church now, and it started after Constantinople, the Patriarch of Constantinople, Bartholomew, agreed that the Orthodox in Ukraine should break completely with Moscow. And this man, who was 39 at the time, he's, I believe, 43 now, is the primate of the Orthodox Church of Ukraine. Can you tell us anything about him and this church and how this came to be?
So the main figure in the history of this church is Metropolitan Philaret. He was Metropolitan of Kiev since 1966, so quarter of the century also in the Soviet time. And after that, for a long time in the after Soviet time. And this Epiphanius was a kind of pupil of him, a good boy near him. And I suppose it is also the problem in this process of autocephaly in between 2018 and 19.
Right.
There was a decision. There was an idea of this Philaret. Now we are becoming independent autocephalous church, and I, as Philaret, will rule the church in the future as a whole. But this Epiphany will be representing our church outside, abroad. This was the idea. So I would say Epiphany is, from psychological perspective, is not really a strong personality. He needs different advices. He needs support from other side, and that's why I would say in this church, Orthodox Church of Ukraine, they have some much stronger leaders, bishops and metropolitans, and that's why it is also a problem for us, for our church. We are not really ready to become a part of this church under this primate because of some problems of canonical issue, that there is uncanonical church in the past, but also from other perspectives. For example, our Metropolitan Onufri is so-called studies, an old person that can give you advices in the spiritual life, and this much younger metropolitan, I'm not sure he can give a lot of advices in spiritual life.
All right. So we're
Sometimes
getting,
you need, especially, uh, so it is not important for primate, but nevertheless, in our case, this kind of elder is important in the image of Metropolitan Onufri, and this is not the case in the situation of Metropolitan Epiphany.
all right. So as an outsider, I cannot make any of these judgments, and I don't want to make them. But I'm appreciative of hearing from you as a Ukrainian and as an Orthodox believer, and as someone who experienced the Soviet time and now has experienced this 30 years of post Soviet time, and now are experiencing this war. I sense in what you say that the Ukrainian people are very much trying to find a path which can provide some continuity with their past and some ability to confront the great problems that the country faces and the region faces. And you made the decision to stay with not go with this autocephalous church, which dates to early 2019. So 2 years before the war, there was a decision to break the Orthodox in Ukraine away from the Orthodox Patriarchate of Moscow. And up until that time, Moscow had about 40% of all of its parishes in Ukraine. So it was a very important region for Moscow. And Filaret had been considered, the older man, the very strong man who had been the metropolitan for many years of Kiev, he had been considered to become Patriarch of Moscow. That's how,
Once,
correct?
yeah, in 1990.
1990. And that's when Alexei II was elected. And it
Yes.
was just at the end of the Soviet Union time. And during the 90s, people sometimes forget, was a terrific period of chaos as a massive 70-year-old communist system with its schools, its ministries, its agencies, its ways of doing was privatizing into the Russia and the Ukraine that now exist. But the 90s were very confusing, correct?
Yes.
And
This what,
so then came from the period from 2000 to 2010, it seemed as if things could be worked out so that there could develop a more sort of less authoritarian and there could be a friendly relationship not only between Russia and Ukraine, which had many millions of people in the same church, but between Russia, Ukraine, and the West. It was as if we could work together. You were going to conferences in Germany, everyone was talking, and in the teens, there started to be, these last 10 years, a kind of division, both inside of the Eastern countries, Russia, Ukraine, Belarus, but also in the West about the direction of our churches, of our societies. And this, in the West, we observed the double way in which John Paul II was viewed, and then the way in which Benedict XVI was viewed. These Catholic popes trying to teach the Catholic faith were appreciated as long as they spoke in a way, John Paul II in a way as a political antagonist of the Soviet Union during the 1980s. But during the 1990s, when he started to criticize some aspects of Western culture, saying, unfortunately, we were embracing a kind of selfish, materialist culture of death, he called it, and that we needed to return to a more Christian culture of life. But he started to be criticized in the West for that. And Benedict received that same type of criticism. So we're looking at both cultural and political changes of massive proportions because Europe was divided by the Iron Curtain, and we had American soldiers in bases there all these decades facing the Soviet Union. We thought we would have the kind of peace dividend of the 90s and into this present century, and we staggered towards this war in a series of steps which people may debate as NATO expanded and as the Russian leadership kind of took more control, in a sense, of the chaotic period of the 90s. And one of the great events in these years was this decision to break the Ukrainian Orthodox Church away from Moscow. This man that we're looking at became the head of that church, but you didn't go along. You remained in some way in the old church. And that is the next slide we have. Do we have Onufri on here? May I ask yes. And this is the second main Ukrainian church, which is more in continuity with the old Ukrainian Orthodox Church. And this is the man you referred to as somewhat a starets. You said that he's regarded as a holy man. A starets, am I correct, is a holy man?
An elder.
An elder.
That can give advices in spiritual life.
So,
Yes, he's much older, you can see. And it is also important for Ukraine. He comes and he lived a lot of time in Chernivtsi region. It is in the western part of Ukraine near Romania. So in his person, it is false to divide Ukraine into western and eastern part. So he represents the western part of Ukraine. But at the same time, for a long period of time, he was a monk in Russia in the Soviet time. He was a monk for several decades in Russia, hegemonos, and that's why I suppose he loves Russia, Russian people, and he understands them much more. He has many friends there, I suppose, and so on. So he was in this in Russian Troitsa Sergeyeva Lavra, so Trinity monastery of Sergei of Radonezh. There is the center of the Moscow Theological Academy, and he has this connection to different monks, to different students that became later priests and bishops, and that's why for him it is. These are not the enemies. They are not. He can understand them good. But since 1990, I suppose, he is again in Ukraine. He was a hegemonos of an important Pochayev Lavra in the western Ukraine, and after that he became a bishop and later metropolitan in Chernivtsi, so in this region he comes from. And that's why in his personality we see this connection between Ukraine as a whole, and especially western Ukraine, with Russia. And it was not a connection of a conflict. In his person, we see this peaceful connection, and it is also a part of his personality. For example, he was a head of the church court officially, and he tried in every case that both sides come to negotiation, to peace, and without real quarrel with each other. So it is a part of his personality to be a church person, maybe sometimes against political influences in the church, but also a person of this reconciliation between different church people, churches, also local churches. So we can say about his participation at the reconciliation between the Russian Orthodox Church in Russia and outside of Russia, Rokor. And he was involved very actively. So he likes that idea that Christians should be together. And now in the situation of the war, it is difficult to have this position.
May I ask your personal relationship with him? Have you met him? Do you know him? Have you had lunch and dinner with him?
Yeah, yes. So officially he is so the head of our theological academy.
Okay, so you're a professor and you're under
Yes.
him.
So
I see.
he's not really deeply involved, but sometimes 2 3 times per year he comes to the academy to us uh, to celebrate the end of the year, academic year, or to have a prayer before the starting of the academic year. And there are some conversations, and also so uh, I'm not connected to him very much, but it is possible for me to see him, to visit him, sometimes to speak with him. So sometimes we are in a personal contact as well.
Okay, I asked in the Vatican what their judgment was, but this is years ago. This is 7 8 years ago. So much before this war and much before the split in the church. And they said so he was at that time the one head of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church, or of the Orthodox people of Ukraine, were all under him, and he was in relationship with Moscow. That's how it was. And the Vatican said, or an official of the Vatican, an important official, said to me, in some ways, he is so holy that he cannot be effective in the turmoil that is now facing Ukraine. And I guess he doesn't like to give a public speech. He likes to speak privately. He's a man who counsels people in prayer and in spiritual life. He's a pastor. You reminded us now of things that I knew, but you emphasized that he spent many years in Russia, and that is tragic in a way that those connections which were built up in personal relation. You said he liked some of the monks, he liked some of the priests, he liked people who were bishops, who he was a student with or a monk with, and it's hard for him to hate the country. And so it's a natural desire to find a way to overcome this tragic war. But is he is he that is he can he do more than he's done? Is he too tired? Is he too old? He's past 80 now.
Yes, he is old, but he is active. Uh, so I don't know a lot about his illnesses, for example.
Hmm.
So he likes to visit the Mount Athos, for example. So
Mount Athos in Greece.
in Greece, so it was usual for him to visit different parts of Ukraine with pastoral visits. So he is active, but the problem is maybe he is spiritually oriented, and in Ukraine and maybe in Russia, uh, we exist in the situation of this in the traditional form of symphonia. So this symphony of secular and spiritual powers, and the role of the spiritual leader is not really to be actively political person. People that are in the church are waiting first of all for spiritual advices for something like this, and uh, in this form of cooperation between the state and the church, he would be good as a spiritual leader.
I see.
But now we have another situation. We now see the situation of contradiction within the state and the church, and at the same time, I suppose Metropolitan Onufri understands deeply the nature of the church, and especially the situation that the church should be not subordinated to the state. The church has its own nature. It should proclaim Jesus Christ and his teaching and so on. And that's why we cannot be a part of the state propaganda, either
Well,
on the Russian side or in the Ukrainian side. The
okay.
church
Well,
speak and about other things, and it is also interesting for me to mention the figure of the Pope of Pope Francis. He tries to be also uh, above this conflict to speak positively for both sides. I suppose our Metropolitan Onufri tries to make the same. He
Mm.
try In Ukraine we have different large cultural differences or linguistic differences between eastern and western parts of Ukraine, and he tries to be uh, a spiritual father for all of Ukrainian Orthodox Christians. But now, in the situation of the political contradiction of the conflict of the war, it is difficult, and
Well,
that's why we can say he is not so successful as a person is in this political conflict of Ukraine.
all right. Let's go back to the monastery and let's talk about this question of the government of Ukraine and its passing of legislation, which is in some ways against the internal life and practice of a religious body. And yet their claim is that it's necessary because these religious people may in some way be traitors to the nation because of their connection with Russia. This is a very deep, delicate, complicated question. I don't know if you even want to address it because maybe even you don't want to speak about it because you are in Ukraine.
I can speak, especially in English, about almost everything.
All
So
right.
it is possible to find this interview or this discussion in Ukraine and to see it. But if I speak in Ukrainian, it is possible to find this discussion much easier. So um, I can formulate my thoughts, my ideas, and I suppose it is not really prohibited in Ukraine. So I would say uh, for many people in the Orthodox Church, and especially of the older generation, this question of the state-church relationships is very important. The church will be wants to be free from this church, from the state authority, from the state pressure on the church. And I know several examples. These people that are now very active in this process of legislative initiatives and so on, with the pressure on our church, they have an atheistic background. As young people, they were atheists.
That's
And
an interesting.
this is an important question. So, uh, for example, Viktor Yelensky, he was born, he lived very in the Soviet Union. He has studied philosophy and religion studies in the Soviet Union,
What
and
what is his role right now in the government?
he is most important person in religious affairs. Now the structure is uh, a state service for religious for ethnopolicy and freedom of consciousness, I suppose. This is the title officially. And he's the head of this institution since several months. And sometimes, so it is important not only for him, but for this older generation of state people that think in this state way, that we should defend the state in our situation of the war. And it is clear for them they have priorities, and the state is on the first place, and the church freedom is on the second place.
Mm,
They are ready for the situation that the church is subordinated to the state. And
yeah.
for people like Onufri, it is the opposite. It So we can see a lot of convictions that if you do not support, if you are not supporting the Ukrainian state, it means automatically that you are supporting the Russian state. But it is possible to speak about not contradiction between two states, Russian and Ukrainian states, but between the state in Ukraine and the church as a sphere of freedom from this state pressure on religious people. I suppose for older people like Metropolitan Onufry, it is important. So to be and to remain free from this state nationalistic pressure in Ukraine.
So, what should be the solution to this dispute over the Lavra? What will happen to it? Will it be empty, or the other church will take it over? I guess the state officially, under the Soviets, had taken property rights over it, but had allowed the monks to stay there. And the state in the post-Soviet time, Ukraine, does own the Lavra, but the tradition was the monks would stay there. Now they're going to be evicted. What should happen?
Lavra was open till 1961. After that, it was closed,
Ah,
and it as a monastery,
hmm.
and it was a reserve, national reserve, so museums and so on, so of this religious direction, but secular people. And since 1988, so 1,000 years after this baptism of Kiev Rus, this monastery was opened again for for monk life. And since that time, there are monks. 1 year later, maybe, since 1989 exists the theological seminary. After that, theological academy as the second level of the theological education. So more than 30 years, the monks and the theological education exist on this territory, and it was usual as a part of this religious freedom. And our church was an important part of religious landscape in Ukraine, and that's why now it is not clear what is the future of this monastery. The problem is that officially the state authorities say there were some problems with the misusage of this territory, because it is a kind of museum territory. It was not allowed to build, for example, new buildings, to make renovations without special permission from the state and so on. So, but we speak more about this Lavra. So this part where the administrative center, theological academy, and monastery are located, and this part of Lavra was under the monks and under the authority of our church leadership. And I would say officially now alternative is there is a monastery, monk life, and this educational center, or there is no educational center. But really, we exist now in this conflict between two Orthodox jurisdictions. And in fact, it is a kind of pressure from the state on our church to become a part of this unification process of both Orthodox churches. For example, Minister of Culture, Alexander Tkachenko, said in one interview several days ago, if the monks are ready to become a part of this Orthodox Church of Ukraine, there will be no problem for them to stay there in the monastery after that.
I see.
So there are some official reasons for the monastery and for other institutions of our church, some mistakes in this building process and so on, but really it is a part of this large pressure on our church from different perspectives, that he becomes a part of this dialogue with another church, with this Orthodox Church of Ukraine. And I would say the problem is these are two different problems. So if we are not really patriotic from the from the state perspective, it can be the reason. But it is not a good time now to unify two Orthodox jurisdictions in Ukraine.
Hmm.
So we exist now in the situation of the war, and it is important to make everything that helps us to win in this war. And I suppose that these problems for our church uh, uh, bring us to other problems and not to resolution of this problem. This is the problem from my perspective.
Well, I'm still actually trying to wrap my mind about around the entire situation. And I recognize that you yourself, you told me, you don't want to break bonds of friendship that you've had your whole life in your own church. And the decisions that were taken at the time of the creation of the autocephalous church, the new church, struck you and many in your church as non-canonical. They were illegal. They didn't go by the traditional procedures. And so you've stayed with this church. You know Onufri personally, he's stayed. But all of you have tried to make very clear that you're not in favor of Russian aggression. You just are in favor of century-old traditions of church behavior which you feel were violated. So it's a religious freedom position, but it's a very difficult position because of the tensions now in creating a totally unified Ukraine with regard to the war situation. Is that all correct?
Yes, it is.
Okay. Well, I think we're going to have to end our conversation, and I think we've gained some knowledge by having you personally here as a man sort of in the middle who grew up in the Soviet Union when your loyalty to your church was a disloyalty to the Soviets. You were kind of wasn't that the case under the Soviet? If you were in church and going to church and thinking of becoming a theologian, weren't you regarded as an unusual figure?
So in 1991, I was 15. So at the end of the Soviet Union. And I know, so my interest to the church was since 14 years. And I could see this um, uh, beginnings of the church life in Ukraine. And I have also seen the
Wait. Maybe be very precise. When did you start practicing joining the church?
so the first interest was approximately in 1990. I have started to come to the church choir,
I see.
and in 1996 I have started my theological education. So it was in the previous century.
Hmm.
You can see. So and that's why I know and I can remember the late Soviet Union was a state with people that didn't believe in this state propaganda.
Hmm.
They wanted to be free from this church state pressure, and I suppose these are also the situation in Russia now. So the pressure of the state, but people in their private life want to be more free than the state wants.
Hmm.
And in Ukraine, we have a lot of freedom. Religious legislation in Ukraine is also very free. There are a lot of different jurisdictions, confessions, Orthodox Christians, different other Christians, a lot of different Protestants, and so on. So it is, I suppose, a reaction on this pressure from the atheistic state in the Soviet time
Hmm.
that all people can decide for themselves what they believe in, and that's why this pressure now on this unification process between two Orthodox jurisdictions contradicts to this usual situation that we have since 30 years.
I see.
And that's why I suppose so the church can control the external behavior of people, what they do, but it is not possible to control what they believe, I suppose.
Hmm.
We,
Well, what,
we need this partnership between the church and the state on the one side, but we should support this idea of religious freedom in Ukraine for personalities against in the face of the state. And from the perspective of our state now in the situation of the war, if you are not on the part of the Ukrainian state, you are automatically on the part of the Russian state. So they think in this paradigm of two states, but for many people, I suppose they are Ukrainians, they like Ukraine, but they don't want really that the Ukrainian state comes too much in their personal life, in their private life. I suppose it is important for many people in Ukraine.
all right. You are speaking of, you called it a paradigm, two paradigms. One is more sort of unified state with control over religion, and the other is a space for freedom of religion, which we have enshrined in the United States in our First Amendment of our Constitution. We believe in that, but it's hard not to have that collapse whenever there are tremendous societal desires for unity of the nation. And you're right in the middle of that right now. And my heart goes out to you in your situation. I appreciate what you are passing through. And I'd like to speak with you again to find out precisely how the life of Christian is proceeding now, this springtime and Easter time. So we'll come back and talk again, and we'll be able to go through some of the questions people have raised as we've been talking. And I appreciate you very much, Sergey, and hope to continue our discussion.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Well, we are still live. The producer